Understanding that there's a decency, which we can kind of have a conversation about human nature and what that means, but Orwell believed deeply in human beings, deeply in people to come together. In many ways, the democratic process, the democratic enterprise, is an enterprise to bring people together who are very different from one another and to somehow cross those divides and build a future together. And if I just add one more sentence before I relate to Israeli politics as such today, one of the greatest threats to democracy, right? And there are many, as we know, but one of them is this loss of ability to believe that we are committed to a future together, that the people across from us, in all these different divides or fault lines that we have, right, are partners, even though we disagree. Right? And this works in all directions. And there's so much survey data that is out there about our move from a politics where we're trying to figure out a life together to a politics where basically we're right, they're wrong, doesn't matter who, and we are going to beat you in the ballot box. And that kind of democracy, which we have evolved into for all sorts of reasons, which the echo chambers of Facebook and the algorithms along it have helped us to enter those echo chambers so dramatically, it's not a politics that can hold, because then it's only about the process of voting and not a process of a people or a group of people coming together to build that future together. I say all of this as a long introduction to a short piece that I wanted to say about this government, which there's the obvious explanation about the Israeli government today, which is that it's a marriage of convenience. And I put that, in the title of what I said. 4 elections, one after the other, not able to build anything that can hold together. And finally, in this 4th round, these unlikely bedfellows that someone to go one step further basically come together because they believe that Netanyahu is an existential threat to Israel from whatever direction they were coming at that question. And somehow they banded together to not have to go to a 5th election and to be able to create a government without Netanyahu. That is a central storyline in the story that we tell us about what happened in this government. And I'm not going to say that there's not a tremendous amount of truth to that. Right? It's clearly part of what happened. And it was like the motor that allowed people to make this jump. But I think you've also got to recognize how extraordinary what happened, in fact, is. People who had been historically ideological, not adversaries, enemies, right? Where the deep delegitimization of one another has taken place for such a long time, came together and formed a government that, at least to this point, holds. Who knows what's going to happen tomorrow, what's going to happen next week. And my argument is that the things that I just talked about, the politics of paradox, the idea that relationships can trump ideological divides, the fact that the common good can somehow force us into a situation where we put aside some things, even if it means compromising some of our most fundamental convictions about what needs to take place, and those things can come together. I say this as a witness to this process already for quite a long time in Israel, and full disclosure, it's a lot of the work that I do. We've been watching it on a local level, in a number of different places. I can name 6 or 7 mayors that got elected on exactly that platform, and were able to build coalitions within their towns that broke the ideological divides and brought people that are just tired of the culture wars, tired of the drag and mud and throwing it out and worrying about their kids' futures and how do you build those things together, right? The mayor of Beit Shemesh brought together this kind of a coalition, that's that. The mayor in Yerucham, now a second mayor in Yerucham, was able to do those things, bringing together the different chamulot in, for example, in Chura. Mohammed al-Nabari, the extraordinary mayor, ex-mayor now of Chura, was able to build coalitions that never existed before that brought those things together. And so I believe, I'm not self-serving here, I believe it's a trend. And certainly it's bursting out onto the national level. We have 3 people that are graduate we have a kind of a leadership program, political leadership program that brings all these voices together. 3 of them are now in the Knesset, including one of them who is the majority whip, as I like to say to donors from America. She's the Nancy Pelosi of Israel, right? She's the majority whip of this government. She's a religious, Masorti, traditional Mizrahi, woman who grew up in Rehovot. And for the Amina party, she's connected to Naftali Bennett in his political party, and her best buddy is in Avodah, is in the Labor Party, and the number 5 person, a woman, is in the Ra'am party, the Arab religious party, the Islamic party that's there as well. And a lot was made of it, hugs with one another, a lot of pushback, particularly from the right about this kind of stuff. But what I'm saying is it's not accidental. There's stuff that's going on that people see it as the demand of the hour to reach across the aisles and build those things. I wanted to say a couple of things about what I've seen in this government that I think are images of them, and they're soft things. They're soft things, but they're important to me. First of all, the phrase that we use for it is the common good, something that Yair Lapid talks about all of the time. And it's a phrase that entered in the political conversation of how do you bring these groups together. And it's come to symbolize what I read about, you also about what Ruby Rivlin said, of bring those things together. 1. 2, Lapid and Bennett have been close friends for almost a decade, right? They in their previous run in the government together, a phrase in Israel that many of you know, it's like a little macho thing going, achi, right? My brother, achi. The 2 of them call themselves achi all of the time, right? There's brothers. And in a recent interview with Bennett on national television in the evening, a more personal front, they asked him about his friendship with Lapid, including whether he's going to stand up to the coalition agreement of the rotation. And he said, Lapid is my close friend, right? It was in the political context, talking about friendship as a category that's relevant, right? That's relevant to who we are and how we think about things and where we see them. So this relationship between Lapid and Bennett has those runs. Another thing that's really interesting, and it's really soft, so you know that, but all of a sudden, and I promise you, it's all of a sudden, all of the ministers of government are calling each other by their first names. And it's if you just pay attention to it, it's super interesting, right? And particularly, everybody, I won't expose my particular politics and all of this and all pieces of it, but I'll say that Avigdor Lieberman, who does not have a reputation of a soft, fuzzy guy in any sense. Everyone says, like, he's lowered the tone, he's lowered the volume, right? The crossing between him and Nitzan Horowitz around those fronts, they've gotten their talking points. It's the way that they phrase these things. It's the way that, by their last names, it's the way that they phrase them, these things, and Toby, not necessarily, not only their last names, sometimes some things that we connected to the last names that went along with that was around it. They do that. And then I just want to say one other thing about the Ra'am party, right, which is an extraordinary thing that's just happened, right? It doesn't seem extraordinary maybe, but the context of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, right, which whatever you think about it, sits deeply within the politics of Israel. For an Arab party to have made that leap, for a right-wing party to go with that, it helped the fact that it seems like Netanyahu is willing to do that as well. But to go with that, and Elkin, who just yesterday was in talks in Russia with Putin, along with Bennett, translating, because he himself comes from the Ukraine, Elkin has been leaked as saying that we have to find ways to help Mansour Abbas, to help Ra'am, to build those connections that are around that. Now, there's a lot of politics that pull these things apart. There's a lot of politics in everybody's home base that pulls them apart from one another and shoves them apart. But these are, especially the Ra'am party, which I could talk a lot about what's happening inside the Israeli Arab community and what this symbolizes and the tensions that are in that. We've got an Arab leadership program that's made up of the two factions that are pretty much at war with one another about these things and figuring out, but they themselves are trying to figure out how do we embrace those connections between us. And it's fascinating conversations. So my point is that, that in that picture, that I'm describing, it's not just a marriage of convenience that's going on. There are some trends that we have seen on a local level, on a civil society level. We know individual people that are in this government that own this stuff as a way of relating to the politics, and we've seen those things connected. Now, tomorrow, all of this can kind of slash and burn in a second. And the flaws of what I just described are obviously always there as well, right? Some people say that we're frozen. Those people that are particularly concerned about a potential peace agreement with the Palestinians and the lack of movement. And we can talk about all of those things as well. But I think any movement in Israel, any movement, is dependent on our ability to move together. And if it's going to be a culture war between us, the society cannot hold together. And this is a harbinger of something deep that is going on that might not last in national government for a long time. It was a freak of nature in certain ways, but it's a freak that's not just a freak. And I want to, so those are some of the things that I wanted to say. I will bracket a whole piece that I wanted to talk about who's not in this coalition. And I think it's important. The Haredi piece, which is an important conversation as to what's happening and how they see themselves. But particularly, I want to do a call out for class issues, right? One of the failures of Rivlin's speech is that there's no class analysis whatsoever. It's all about ethnic tribes. It's not about, in addition, the very clear socioeconomic issues that are part of that. And in the socioeconomic issues that are part of it, the support of Netanyahu, without doubt, comes from the lower middle class, the Mizrahim, right, that are loaded in there until Israel figures out how to break out of the elite populism divide. All of these things will explode at one point and another. And I'm not sure if this government has enough sensitivity to understand that, and it might be its ultimate downfall. So that was just as the critics. And then in the last thing that I wanted to say, and we've got 2 minutes, a piece from Iyyun, which I use a lot in talks. And I think there's a lot here, actually, and there's also a larger piece before it and afterwards that can said, but in its own, I think it has a lot of the components that I'm talking about. So you know about the House of Hillel, the House of Shammai, Beit Hillel, Beit Hillel. For 3 years, the House of Hillel and the House of Shammai argued. One said the halakha is according to our position, and the other said the halakha is according to our position. By the way, there is, in case you think this is just benign conversation between two rabbinic schools, there is testimony within the Talmud to the fact that these things broke out in violence and people were killed between the two camps. So this is not just a sweet, warm and fuzzy conversation between the two sides. A heavenly voice spoke. These and those are the words of the living God, and the halakha is according to the House of Hillel. Notice 2 things. Both are the words of a living God, but the halakha is according to the House of Hillel. In other words, the halakha is not the voice of the living God. The voice of the living God combines these 2 things, but the halakha is according to the House of Hillel. A question was raised. Since the heavenly voice declared both these and these are the words of the living God, why was the halakha established to follow the opinion of Hillel? If they're both that, why do we choose Hillel? And he says, it is because the students of Hillel were kind and gracious. They taught their own ideas as well as the ideas from the students of Shammai. Furthermore, they even taught Shammai's opinions first. Now, once again, not kumbaya for a second, but the point here in the text, which I think is powerful, is the text that Beit Hillel doesn't have truth, Beit Shammai doesn't have truth, right? Neither one of them has truth, but you get closer to the truth. You get closer to the truth if you take the other side seriously. Beit Hillel, the halakha was like theirs because it was, in fact, dealing with, hearing the arguments and integrating what it is was being argued by Beit Shammai. And because of that, it was closer to the living God. if you know the famous Chinese kind of picture, a bunch of blind people trying to describe an elephant, everyone holding a different person of the elephant, therefore describing the elephant differently from one another because they see different parts of it. How do we build a democracy that allows us to understand that we all see different parts of this and to build a common good that's able to transcend each one of our short-sightedness into some kind of a view that's more holistic and more encompassing, more humane, more decent to those. So that's what I have to say. And do we have 3 or 4 minutes to talk? Or are you going to throw us out? 2 minutes. Okay. Other families.
Eilon, I have a question.
Sure.
I just wrote it on the chat. Is it right to say that this, disagreeing politics is something that has been in Israeli politics ever since 1982, ever since the governments of Shamir and Peres and Rabin and Ehud Barak and Ariel Sharon and Ehud Olmert, and all those governments were, they were combined of very different political valuable opinions and observations, and they joined forces for the common good. So maybe it's not such a new feature. Maybe it's something that we've, kind of left out of our politics over the past 12 or 13 years, and it came back.
So just as a quick, one of the things that I'm arguing is that there's a different DNA about what's going on right now, right? That for various reasons, and I think I want to be careful about that, right? There's kind of like a difference. Sometimes we call it the radical center, right? There's a difference between this coming together that's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, the end of ideology in the weak sense of the term, right? That values, don't matter. I mean, to go to the class issue once again, we had massive neoliberal kind of economic policy that took over during all of those years as kind of part of that movement that went on. You can think of, New Labor in England, the Clinton years in America, and certainly Ehud Barak held those things. We have to go through. And I think, there is a reaction to particularly the divisive last 10 years in Israeli society, the divisiveness of this. And I think there's a reckoning, and this is the last thing, going back to, I think, what I was saying before. And again, that personal thing and maybe connected to some of all of us sitting here as well, right? I was in Israel on your course in 1977 when Menachem Begin was elected prime minister. Menachem Begin, for the leading group of Israelis at the time, it was the rise of fascism in Israeli society, period, right? The left dreams of a right that's in the spirit of Menachem Begin today. The move from an Ashkenazic cultural kind of frame to slowly but surely a move to a more Masorti, a more traditional, a more Mizrahi. Listen to the music. Arik Einstein was the voice of Israel in 1977. Who's the voices of Israel in their music in 2022? Name them, Omer Adam. Just like one after the other. There's this massive shift that's going on. That shift is symbolizing a shift that's taking place in all of these places. And so, we can decide, whether I'm overshooting, but I say with a lot of confidence that there's something going on here. And that something that's going on is something that's worth fighting for.